Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Hearing. I'm Brian Taylor. My guests today are Hugo Peris, who's the CEO of Spiral Therapeutics, and with him today is their Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Charles Lim. And they're here today to make us a little smarter on the topic of auditory regenerative medicine and some of the important work their company is doing in this area. And before I start asking them some questions and having them tell us about their studies and their projects, I'd like them to maybe start by telling our audience a little bit about themselves and about their company, Spiral Therapeutics. So, Hugo, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for having us today. It's a pleasure to talk to you. So, Spiral started in 2016 as a hearing company. We've been working for the last 7 years on advancing our pipeline of hearing therapeutics. And we're currently focused on developing a treatment for Meniere's disease, which is already in the clinic.
Great. And Dr. Lim, you're the Chief Medical Officer. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and what you do at Spiral Therapeutics?
Absolutely. And thanks, Brian, for having us. So I'm a neurotologist. I'm currently the Francis Hui Professor and Chief of Otology and Neurotology, Skull-Based Surgery at University of California, San Francisco. And when I moved to UCSF, it was after being at Johns Hopkins Hospital for almost 20 years. And one of the great things about moving to UCSF was the opportunity to collaborate with some of the advances in industry. And so Hugo had approached me by now about six and a half years ago to just learn more about Spiral. And that was at a point where I was feeling some frustration with what was available to us in our standard clinical approaches to hearing loss. And so I found just great excitement and energy in the idea of looking outside the box and just sort of like thinking about alternate ways to get what our patients need. And so with that kind of motivation, I joined Spiral as the Chief Medical Officer, where I still continue to treat patients surgically at UCSF, but with Spiral, I've been working with Hugo and the team to try to advance these really important developments in treating Meniere's disease and other otologic disorders.
Well, I think that's a good springboard into my first question for you. I'll direct this to you, Dr. Lim, and that is, and I mean, this is based on my own experience as an audiologist working in ENT practices years ago, and also what I saw on your website, and that is that something like 90% of inner ear disorders are neurodegenerative or inflammatory in origin. So maybe you could give us some examples for our audience of these types of conditions that are commonly seen in an ENT practice. And then as a follow-up question to that, give us maybe a little idea historically of why those kinds of conditions are so challenging to treat.
Yeah, so let's be perfectly clear about one thing. There's no FDA-approved medications to treat hearing loss today. If you think about where we are in modern medicine and the fact that we have the ability to restore hearing with cochlear implants in somebody who's deaf, the fact that we don't have a single medication that can target hearing loss is really kind of astonishing. Also, if you are a clinician, you realize very soon that we don't have a whole lot to offer besides steroids. And the unusual thing is that if you list kind of a differential diagnosis broadly of different hearing loss conditions, whether it's sudden sentinel hearing loss, Meniere's disease, noise-induced hearing loss, chemotherapeutic ototoxicity, and so forth, if you just kind of go through all of the very common ear disorders that lead to hearing loss, you'll find that we treat all of those with steroids. And the reason for that is not that steroids are used so perfectly in those settings and indications. It's that we don't have anything else that seems better right now. And the linkage between those conditions appears to be some degree of neuroinflammation or cochlear inflammation that seems to benefit from the anti-inflammatory effects of steroids. And so the limitation is partly in that we need more specificity and not just one medicine for all conditions, but also that steroids are very, very effective. It's an impressive medication, but we need to be able to use it better. And so a lot of what we've been thinking about at Spiral is how to get something more effectively where it needs to get to, so that whatever the medicine, whether it's a steroid or something else, it can do its job better.
So maybe that would be, my next question would be, how does Spiral Therapeutics attempt to solve some of the problems that you just mentioned?
Thanks, Brian. I'll take this one. So at Spiral, we've been focusing on looking at the space. It's been great learnings from a lot of the companies that have been trying to address these problems of the inner ear and trying to advance drugs for a range of indications. It's been interesting to us to see some of the reasons why some of these attempts have failed at progressing towards the clinic and towards approval. And we've been trying to learn about this failures and trying to apply a different approach to developing our treatments. The first thing that we've looked at, and the one thing that we're very focused on, is drug delivery. We think drug delivery is one of the biggest challenges of access and of treating inner ear disorders. Systemic drugs or drugs supplied systemically don't reach the inner ear at effective concentrations for the most part, because the cochlea is beyond the blood-brain barrier. And we also know that local delivery, the way it's been traditionally done with blind intratympanic injections, might not be the best solution for effective and reliable deployment of drug treatments. So we've been thinking about that, and we've been building a drug delivery platform which allow us to deploy drugs to the inner ear more precisely, because we do that still minimally invasively and locally, but under visualization, and that gives us the opportunity to place drug delivery systems that will last longer and that will be precisely placed so that we can have that effectiveness of a treatment across every patient that we treat in clinical trials and hopefully beyond. So that's been the core of our technology and the focus that we've been putting on in developing our platform. Then once we built that, we've taken the step of advancing treatment for Meniere's, and that's a steroid treatment that we already have in the clinic, like I explained before. This treatment, we hope, will help us validate our platform, our drug delivery platform. And we're also trying to take those learnings from things that have happened before in the field, from all the experience that has been accumulated by companies and obviously all the physicians that have been using steroids for many, many years, a lot of literature that has been published about this, and trying to make some changes, think about what are the really clinically meaningful outcomes for patients in identifying those results and making sure that we are demonstrating that effect versus a placebo treatment. So that's been the focus of the work, and beyond that, we're going to continue to advance a pipeline, think about other indications mostly related about in hearing and neurodegeneration of the inner ear.
Right. Well, that brings me to the next question, which is about the recent announcement about your receiving funding for a phase 2 trial of SPT 2101. I hope I have that right. Could you tell us a little bit about that trial? What's the objective of the trial? What are you trying to achieve? And maybe a little bit about the design of the trial.
Sure. Maybe I can take that one. So as Hugo mentioned, SPT 2101 is a sort of special steroid formulation that we have, which we're delivering to the inner ear at the round window under direct visualization using minimally invasive approaches. We've completed an initial phase 1 study in Australia, and that study was quite promising. And our goals with the phase 2 study are to build upon what we learned in phase 1, and in specific, we want to get the technology in the hands of more providers. And anytime you're developing something like this, it's you've kind of come up with the idea, and you've sort of established a proof of principle and proof of concept, but now you have to actually see how scalable it is to other practitioners. And so we would like more otologists to now be involved. And so with that goal in mind, we're launching a multi-center trial in Australia, which has just begun in 4 sites in Australia. The initial results from the phase 1 study will be published and presented at the upcoming Asia Pacific otolaryngology meeting by one of our colleagues, Dr. Jaffrey Kuthabuthine. But the phase 2 study will involve more otologists that can be doing this, and with the goal of refining our surgical and in-clinic procedural approaches, but then also establishing effect size parameters. We have a clear sense that this treatment is effective, and now we have to increase the sample size and really learn what the effect sizes are and how they relate to our placebo arms.
I want to make sure that I have this right. The treatment is for people that have been diagnosed with Meniere's disease, right?
Correct. And so what we're doing is we're enrolling patients with active disease. So you have to basically be dizzy currently with Meniere's disease, and we're looking at basically vertigo as the primary endpoint, vertigo control for these conditions. We're using a 1-month run-in period where the patients have to report a certain level of dizziness in order to have the treatment so that we can see if the treatment helps them. And we're excited. I would say this is something that we've clinically, people have used steroids exactly for this purpose for a long time, but the outcomes have always been variable. There's some patients it seems to work great for and others that it doesn't. And so what we're really trying to figure out is how do we improve upon that so that the steroids can really, how we can take advantage of the full anti-inflammatory power of a steroid by putting it where it needs to be placed in the ear and knowing that it's there for that one particular patient.
Yeah, that's really great. I hope that the results are favorable.
As do we. Yeah, no, it's exciting. And look, the field needs something, and we're actively pursuing this with great hopes and great ambition.
That's great. Are there any other drugs in the pipeline that you plan to develop for treatment of inner ear disorders or any other type of otologic conditions?
Yeah, absolutely. We're continuing to think about unmet needs in this patient populations. And, one source of inspiration, again, is what's been happening in the field for the last few years. We have the utmost respect for frequency therapeutics and autonomy, decibel, and the many other companies that have been trying to advance treatments for hearing. We're also disappointed by the fact that some of these companies are no longer focused on this effort. And, we still hope that we'll be able to overcome those challenges and be the ones contributing to advancing this therapy. So beyond the steroid for Meniere's that we're focused on today, we're continuing to build a pipeline. We are very much committed to the traditional approaches to drugging the ear. So gene therapy is for now an approach that we are not focused on at Spiral. We think that small molecules and small proteins might actually be good solutions in a field that's, like Dr. Lim mentioned, there are no drugs approved yet. So we're committed to advancing those type of developments. And we're looking at a range of neuroprotective, otoprotective assets that could help us address different types of hearing loss, from chemotherapy induced to age-related noise induced. So we're very much excited about all these opportunities, recognizing that these are very not well-defined patient populations where there's still a lot more work to do in terms of identifying who are the patients that are most likely to respond to this type of treatments. And we also believe that the field has made a lot of progress over the last few years in identifying those patient populations, establishing what are the right outcome measures, and we're going to try to learn upon those things and implement them into our studies so that we can be more precise in the development of our treatments.
Yeah, that's great. We hope to have you back sometime in the near future, and you can talk about some of the other exciting developments that you have going on.
And Brian, let me just add one thing to that. It's one thing to not have a medication, but it's another thing to have a medication and not know how to get it to where it needs to get. And so there's a twofold problem. It's not likely that a treatment for the inner ear is going to be a pill that you just take. That's just the odds of that being the solution here are low. And so it's very likely that we're going to have to deliver something to a relatively inaccessible space. The nice thing about the platform that we're building is that it is somewhat agnostic to the actual agent, meaning once we have refined and perfected the approach, which is already very functional and usable, you could basically put anything. You could deliver almost any agent physically to where it needs to get to. And so we're excited about not just our own pipeline, which is great, and the own steroid formulations of SPT-2101, but the concept that any agent in the future might benefit from the work that we're doing. When you try to change a field, it doesn't happen with just one small team. And this is kind of a field-wide effort. And so I think we all have to kind of join forces and hope that our work can supplement and synergize with each other.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And maybe you could talk a little bit about this, the delivery mechanism. I guess I'm curious to know, what have you learned over the last 6 or so years that your company's been in existence about how the delivery system, what's important about that? What have you learned? What do you know now today about it that you didn't know 5 years ago? Could you speak to that a little bit?
I can. Let me get into, without getting into too many specifics, I want to just say that something that might not be clear to audiologists, but it's very clear to otologists. Right now, in the way we treat things intratympanically, there's a big assumption, a number of assumptions that are made that the medication is going to get to where it needs to. But if you actually break down each of those assumptions and then look at the potential obstacles, what you learn is that there are many obstacles that are preventing right now standard intratympanic therapy from getting into the cochlea. And so what we have sort of resorted to is, I mean, you're probably very aware of this today, we just blindly stick needles into the eardrum and hope that somehow what's in the syringe lands in the cochlea, inside the cochlea. That's not a given. There's pseudomembranes, there's air bubbles, there's redirection, there's like clearance down the eustachian tube. There's like the medication can be nowhere near the round window by the time the patient walks out of the clinic. And so we need some certainty, some assurances that the medicine is first being placed to where you need it at the round window, which is the best apparent entry point into the cochlea, but also furthermore, that there's durability, that over time, the patient's not going to swallow their lunch and then find that the medication is suddenly gone. Now, there needs to be some persistence of this medication where you want it. And so we're working on all of the above, minimally invasively, how to deliver that to the round window in a durable way.
That's great. And my last question, and I think I already kind of sort of know the answer based on our conversation, and that is, if you have a crystal ball and these treatments are proven to be successful in your clinical trials, how do you see them changing the way that otology is practiced in the clinic?
I think otology is desperate for more solutions. Think about the patient that comes in with sudden sensorineural hearing loss that we see all the time. And every week I see this in my clinic. And what we have to offer them is just really not very reassuring. It's a hope. And what I think will happen is a new generation of procedural interventions where you're not just getting a pill, you're not going to the OR. There's something in between. It's an office-based procedure that offers a much higher likelihood of control. And, some of the benefits that we're hoping for are really based on advances that were well established in ophthalmology, which as a field I would say is quite ahead of otology, and much of Spiral's roots really are in ophthalmologic advances because some of our scientific founders had ophthalmology backgrounds and they were doing things that otologists really could learn from. And so our hope is that a lot of the procedural based things in the clinic that would help somebody with hearing loss, which don't exist, will spawn a kind of new generation of kind of mid-level interventions that I think would be very helpful.
Right. And Hugo, any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
Just thank you for the time. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about Spiral and explain a little bit about the work we've been doing. We're very passionate about the field. We do think that there are many unmet needs. We're excited about this opportunity to advance the field, to introduce innovations. And we're just going to continue to work hard to bring these drugs closer to patients.
That's great. Hugo Peris and Dr. Charles Lim of Spiral Therapeutics, thanks for your time. We really appreciate you being with us today at This Week in Hearing.